Ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone attacks the character, motive, or other attribute of the person making an argument rather than addressing the substance of the argument itself. The aim is to discredit the person to undermine their argument. Hasty generalization. The hasty generalization involves making a broad generalization based on a small or unrepresentative sample of data. The conclusion is reached too quickly without considering all relevant evidence, leading to a potentially false conclusion. Red herring fallacy. A red herring is a distraction from the main issue. It introduces an irrelevant topic into the discussion, diverting attention away from the original argument and leading the conversation off course. Tu quoque fallacy. Tu quoque, or the you-too fallacy, attempts to discredit an argument by pointing out that the opponent engages in the same behavior. It shifts focus from the argument to the opponent's actions or past statements. Slippery slope fallacy. This fallacy argues that a specific action will inevitably lead to a chain of related and typically negative events without providing evidence to support this progression. It suggests that one step will lead to a cascade of outcomes. Special pleading fallacy. Special pleading occurs when someone applies different standards to similar situations without valid justification. It often involves creating an exception to a general rule without adequate reasoning. Loaded question. A loaded question is phrased in such a way that it contains a presumption that traps the respondent, making any direct answer appear to confirm the assumption. It's designed to limit or control the response. False dilemma fallacy. The false dilemma or false dichotomy presents only two options or outcomes when in reality there may be multiple alternatives. Strawman fallacy. This fallacy misrepresents or oversimplifies an opponent's argument to make it easier to attack. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning, or begging the question, occurs when the conclusion of an argument is assumed in the premises. The argument goes in a circle, with no independent support for the conclusion. Appeal to authority fallacy. An appeal to authority relies on the opinion of an authority figure or institution as evidence for an argument. Appeal to nature fallacy. This fallacy suggests that something is good, correct, or preferable because it is natural. It assumes that what is natural is inherently better without examining the actual merits or context of the situation. Composition fallacy. The composition fallacy assumes that what is true for individual parts is also true for the whole. It overlooks the possibility that the whole may have different properties than its components. Division fallacy. The division fallacy assumes that what is true for the whole must also be true for its individual parts. It fails to recognize that properties of the whole may not apply to individual elements. Affirming the consequent. This fallacy occurs when someone assumes that if the consequent is true, then the antecedent must also be true. It confuses the direction of logical implication. Anecdotal fallacy. The anecdotal fallacy uses personal experience or isolated examples instead of sound evidence or comprehensive data. While anecdotes can be illustrative, they are not a substitute for systematic evidence. Appeal to emotion fallacy. An appeal to emotion manipulates the audience's feelings to win an argument rather than using logical reasoning. It relies on emotional responses instead of presenting factual or rational evidence. Burden of proof fallacy. This fallacy shifts the burden of proof from the person making a claim to the opponent. Instead of providing evidence for their own claim, the claimant demands that the opponent disprove it. No True Scotsman fallacy. The no True Scotsman fallacy excludes counterexamples by redefining criteria. When faced with a counterexample, the arguer changes the definition to exclude it, thus maintaining their original assertion. Texas Sharpshooter fallacy. This fallacy focuses on similarities while ignoring differences to make a misleading argument. It involves cherry-picking data to fit a specific conclusion, overlooking data that might contradict it. Suppressed correlative. Suppressed correlative redefines a term in such a way that one option becomes impossible, eliminating meaningful discussion or comparison. Personal incredulity fallacy. This fallacy occurs when something is dismissed as false because it is difficult to understand or believe. The argument relies on the speaker's inability to comprehend the concept rather than evidence. Ambiguity fallacy. The ambiguity fallacy exploits the multiple meanings of a word or phrase to mislead or confuse. It uses ambiguity to create misunderstandings and false conclusions. Genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy judges something based on its origin or source rather than its current meaning or context. It dismisses or accepts an argument solely based on where it came from. Middle ground fallacy. This fallacy assumes that the truth is always a compromise between two extremes. It falsely believes that the middle position between two opposing views must be correct. Affirming a disjunct. This fallacy assumes that if one part of a disjunction, an either-or statement, is true, the other part must be false. It fails to recognize that both parts can be true simultaneously. Appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition argues that something is better or correct because it has been done that way historically. It relies on tradition rather than evaluating the actual merits of the practice. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy continues a project or endeavor based on the cumulative prior investment, time, money, resources, rather than current benefits. Appeal to ignorance. This fallacy claims that a proposition is true because it has not been proven false, or vice versa. It relies on a lack of evidence rather than positive evidence to support a claim. Continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy, or the fallacy of the beard, rejects a distinction because it is unclear where to draw the line. It argues that because there is no clear dividing point, the distinction is invalid. Equivocation. Equivocation uses an ambiguous term in multiple senses within the same argument, leading to a misleading conclusion. It exploits the dual meanings to confuse or deceive the audience. Faulty analogy. A faulty analogy assumes that because two things are alike in one respect, they are alike in other respects as well. It oversimplifies or misrepresents the relationship between the compared entities. Denying the antecedent. This fallacy assumes that if the antecedent is false, the consequent must also be false. It wrongly infers the negation of the antecedent from the negation of the consequent. False cause. The false cause fallacy, or post hoc ergo propter hoc, assumes a causal relationship based on mere correlation. It concludes that because one event followed another, the first event caused the second. Definite fallacy. The definite fallacy involves defining a term in a way that unfairly supports one's argument. It manipulates the definition to create an advantage in the discussion. Ecological fallacy. This fallacy assumes that what is true for a group is also true for each individual within that group. It overgeneralizes from group-level data to individual cases. Etymological fallacy. The etymological fallacy assumes that the original or historical meaning of a word is its true or only meaning. It overlooks how the meaning of words can change over time. Quoting out of context. Quoting out of context distorts a quote's meaning by removing it from its original context. This can misrepresent the speaker's intent or the overall message. False equivalence. False equivalence assumes that two different things are equal because of a perceived similarity. It overlooks significant differences that make the comparison invalid. Historian's fallacy. The historian's fallacy judges past actions or decisions based on present-day knowledge and perspectives. It fails to consider the context and information available at the time. Inflation of conflict. Inflation of conflict exaggerates or overstates disagreement to invalidate claims or arguments. It suggests that any dispute among experts means there is no reliable knowledge on the issue. Ludic fallacy. The ludic fallacy mistakes structured, game-like uncertainty for real-world uncertainty. It assumes that real-world outcomes can be accurately predicted based on simplified, controlled scenarios.